I had a meditation a few days ago that I've honestly struggled to put into words. I spent the meditation sitting beneath an upside down copper pyramid, rocking gently as I counted 100 breath cycles. Somewhere along the way, I remember a wave of euphoria washing over my body, followed by an immense pressure in my third eye. Then, for just a brief moment, I experienced something that felt endless. I was still fully aware of my body sitting in that chair, but at the same time, I became aware of something that felt far larger than my physical self. It was as though I could suddenly perceive the limitations of my body while simultaneously sensing that my consciousness wasn't confined to those same limits. The experience only lasted a moment, but it was enough to leave me asking questions long after the meditation had ended. The interesting thing about experiences like that is that the moment you try to explain them, they begin slipping through your fingers. I've tried describing it to people, I've tried putting it into words for myself in my journal. I've even replayed it over and over in my own mind, hoping I could find the perfect sentence that would finally communicate exactly what happened. Every attempt gets close, but none of them quite reach it. It's a little like trying to describe love to someone who's never been in love, or grief to somebody who's never lost someone they cared about. You can talk about the physical sensations, the emotions, or the thoughts that accompany the experience, but none of those things actually are the experience. They simply point toward it. The words become signposts, but the destination itself has to be encountered firsthand. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this isn't unique to spirituality at all. Some of the deepest parts of being human exist in places where language simply isn't enough. Think about trying to explain what it feels like to hold your newborn child for the first time, or the overwhelming relief that comes after surviving something you genuinely thought might destroy you. Even something as ordinary as laughing so hard your stomach hurts or experiencing an orgasm can never be fully communicated through words alone. We all know these experiences are real. We all know they matter, yet every description we give is ultimately incomplete because language isn't designed to recreate reality. It's designed to point toward it. The map is incredibly useful, but no one would confuse a map with the mountain itself. And that realization stayed with me for the rest of the day. And by the following morning, I knew I needed to start thinking about this week's podcast episode. Usually, before I sit down to write, I spend some time asking Hecate what she would have me explore. And sometimes that answer comes through a feeling. Sometimes it comes through a conversation or a book. Sometimes it comes through something so ordinary that I almost miss it if I'm not paying attention. So I did what has become a fairly normal part of my practice. I simply asked for guidance. Then I did something a little out of the ordinary and I opened YouTube Shorts. The very first video that appeared was from Bartender from TikTok. And she was talking about labels. I don't even remember her exact words because that isn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was the immediate feeling that washed over me as I listened. It was one of those moments where something clicks into place before you even had time to consciously think about why. I remember sitting there and thinking, holy hell, this is so relevant to witchcraft right now. Immediately, my mind jumped to conversations I see online almost every day. People arguing over what qualifies someone as a real witch, endless debates about baby witches, discussions about black magic versus white magic, questions about whether someone's eclectic enough, traditional enough, devotional enough, pagan enough, or whatever other category we've decided to sort ourselves into this week. And at first glance, it seemed like the episode was going to be about labels in witchcraft, but the more I sat with it, the more I realized that that wasn't actually what this conversation was about. What struck me was how quickly our minds take a single word and convince us we've understood an entire person. We hear someone describe themselves as a witch, a Christian, an atheist, a polytheist, or even a chaos magician. And Within seconds, our brains begin filling in the blanks. Before we've asked a single question, we've already started constructing a story about who they are, what they believe, what they value, and how they probably behave. Sometimes those assumptions are fairly accurate. Other times, they couldn't be further from the truth. Yet we rarely stop to ask ourselves where those assumptions came from in the first place. We simply inherit definitions from our families, our cultures, our religions, the internet, or our own experiences, and eventually those definitions become so automatic that we stop recognizing them as assumptions altogether. Now, I want to be very clear here because I think this is where conversations like this can easily go off the rails. I don't believe labels are bad. In fact, I think they're incredibly valuable. Labels help us find community. They help us discover books that resonate with us, teachers who share similar perspectives, and people who've walked paths that resemble our own. Without labels, I probably never would have found Hecate. I wouldn't have known to search for books on Hecate and witchcraft or devotional practice. I wouldn't have discovered communities full of people asking many of the same questions I was asking. Labels gave me a place to begin, and I will always be grateful for that. The problem isn't that labels exist. The problem begins when we forget what they were created to do. Over the last week, one sentence has continued echoing around in my mind, and I think it captures everything I've been trying to articulate. Labels are meant as guides, not as law. A guide gives you a place to start. It points you in a direction, helps you navigate unfamiliar territory without pretending to know every detail of the landscape. Law, on the other hand, feels fixed. It leaves very little room for curiosity, growth, or surprise. When we allow labels to become law, we stop asking questions because we believe we've already found the answer. We stop meeting people where they are because we assume we already know who they are. Somewhere along the way, the guide quietly becomes the destination, and that's where I think we begin losing something profoundly important. As I continued reflecting on all of this, I couldn't help but think about one label that shaped my own life for years, and that was ADHD. Looking back now, I don't think the hardest part was actually living with the symptoms themselves. The hardest part was living with everything I believed those four letters said about me as a person. I wasn't just someone who struggled with executive functioning. In my mind, I was lazy, I was disorganized, I was unreliable, I lacked discipline, I had no follow through. Every forgotten task, every unfinished project, every pile of laundry, and every missed deadline became evidence that those stories were true. I apologized constantly for things that felt outside of my control because I genuinely believed there was something fundamentally wrong with me. I watched other people seem to move effortlessly through life while I felt like I had to exhaust myself just to accomplish what I imagined a normal person could finish before lunch. I wasn't carrying the weight of a diagnosis nearly as much as I was carrying the shame attached to what I thought that diagnosis meant. And that shame shaped the way I saw myself for years. And the saddest part is that I didn't even realize I confused the label with my identity. I had stopped saying I have ADHD and I had stopped saying I have ADHD. And without even speaking the words aloud, I began living as though the truth was this is simply who I am. There's a subtle but incredibly important difference between those two ideas. One describes an experience, and the other defines a person. I didn't know it at the time, but I'd quietly allowed a label that was originally meant to help explain part of my life to become the lens through which I viewed my entire existence. Looking back now, I can see that it wasn't ADHD that had built the cage. It was the story I had unknowingly attached to the label all along. The turning point came when I started taking low-dose naltrexone. Many of you have heard me talk about LDN over the past couple of months because it has genuinely been one of the most significant changes I've experienced in my health. I originally started it for entirely different reasons, but something unexpected happened along the way. Many of the symptoms I had always attributed exclusively to ADHD began to fade. My executive functioning improved dramatically. The constant mental resistance I felt toward even the smallest tasks became quieter. I could transition between activities without feeling like I was dragging myself through wet concrete. It eventually became clear that a significant portion of what I believed were lifelong ADHD symptoms were likely being amplified by inflammation from previous traumatic brain injuries. The diagnosis hadn't suddenly become false. What changed was my understanding of the story surrounding it. And that realization hit me much harder than I expected because it forced me to confront something very uncomfortable. For years, I had accepted the common cultural narrative surrounding ADHD without ever questioning whether it accurately described my own experience. I had unknowingly absorbed the idea that ADHD meant lazy, messy, forgetful, inconsistent, and incapable of following through. Every time I struggled with something, my brain reached for those explanations because they were already waiting for me. The label itself wasn't hurting me, but my interpretation of the label was. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken society's assumptions for objective truth. And in doing so, I had unknowingly participated in my own shame. The more I reflected on that, the more I began noticing how often we do this with every label we encounter. We rarely interact with the word itself. We interact with everything we believe that word represents. If I say the word doctor, every person listening to this episode immediately pictures something slightly different. If I say Christian, each of you will have your own collection of memories, emotions, relationships, and assumptions attached to that word. The same is true if I say witch, atheist, Republican, Democrat, therapist, or police officer. The label acts almost like a filing cabinet in our minds. The moment we hear it, our brains begin pulling out every experience we ever associated with that category. Before we've consciously decided anything, our nervous system has already started writing the rest of the story. The fascinating thing is that our brains aren't doing this because they are broken. They're doing exactly what they evolved to do. Human beings survive by recognizing patterns. If every situation required us to begin from absolute zero, we would spend our entire lives trying to determine whether a hot stove burns or whether a growling animal might be dangerous. Categories help us navigate an incredibly complicated world without becoming overwhelmed by every individual piece of information we encounter. In many ways, labels are one of the brain's greatest efficiencies. They allow us to organize reality quickly enough to function within it. The problem isn't that our brains categorize. The problem is that our brains are perfectly willing to mistake a category for the thing itself. I think this becomes even more significant when trauma enters the picture, because trauma changes the way our brains use categories. A nervous system that has been hurt doesn't simply recognize patterns, it depends on them. If a particular kind of person, environment, behavior, or belief system has caused us pain before, our brains become highly motivated to recognize similar situations as quickly as possible. And that isn't irrational, it's protective. Our nervous systems aren't trying to make us judgmental, they're trying to keep us alive. In many ways, trauma teaches us that certainty is safer than curiosity because certainty allows us to react before we have the chance to be hurt again. And when I really sat with that idea, one sentence came to me so clearly that I immediately wrote it down because I knew it belonged in this episode. Trauma teaches us to survive through labels. Healing teaches us to look beyond them. The first time I read those words back to myself, I cried. Not because they're particularly poetic, but because they explained something I had been experiencing for years without ever having language for it. Trauma isn't just something that happened to us in the past. It changes the way we organize the present. It teaches our brains to sort people into categories as quickly as possible because categories feel predictable and predictability feels safe. If I can identify danger before it reaches me, maybe I won't have to experience that pain again. And as I thought about my own life, I realized how many places this pattern still exists. One of the hardest examples for me to talk about is Christianity because my relationship with it is incredibly complicated. Some of the most painful experiences of my life involved people who identified as Christians. I went on a date with someone once who spent the evening telling me Buddhism was evil, and later, he raped me. I have family members who genuinely love me, yet repeatedly ignore the boundaries I've set around conversations about religion because they sincerely believe that if they don't convince me to return to Christianity, I'll spend eternity in hell. Those experiences don't simply disappear because I intellectually understand that not every Christian believes those things. My nervous system remembers them whether I want it to or not. If I'm being honest, there are still moments where I notice my body becoming cautious the moment I learn someone is a Christian. It happens before I've had a chance to think through it logically. My brain quietly reaches for an old category that once helped me survive. It whispers, "Be careful." There was a time when I felt ashamed of that reaction because I thought healing meant never having those feelings again. Now I understand it differently. Healing doesn't erase the patterns trauma taught my nervous system. Healing simply gives me enough awareness to pause before those patterns become conclusions. Instead of assuming I already know who someone is because of a label, I can become curious enough to ask another question. Some of the people I care about most have challenged those old assumptions in the gentlest possible ways. One of my closest friends is a Christian, and I absolutely adore her. Her faith is beautiful to me, not because I share it, but because I can see the sincerity and compassion and love with which she lives her beliefs. We don't spend our time trying to convert one another. We respect each other's paths while remaining deeply connected as friends. And she reminds me that Christianity is not one thing, it never has been. Just as witchcraft contains countless traditions and beliefs and ethics and practices, Christianity is lived differently by millions of people. The label tells me almost nothing about the individual standing in front of me unless I allow curiosity to fill in what assumption never could. That realization made me wonder how often we unknowingly ask other people to carry the weight of definitions that they never chose for themselves. Maybe someone introduces themselves as a witch, and before they've shared a single belief, another person has already decided they're dangerous or that they worship the Christian idea of the devil. Maybe someone says they're an atheist, and another person immediately assumes they have no morality or spiritual depth. Maybe someone shares that they have ADHD, and everyone around them quietly lowers their expectations because they've confused a diagnosis with a person's potential. Every one of those situations begins the same way. A guide becomes law. A starting point becomes a conclusion. A label that was meant to introduce a conversation ends up replacing it entirely. And if that's true in our relationships with other people, then I can't help but wonder how often we're doing the exact same thing within witchcraft itself. We spend so much time trying to define ourselves and everyone around us that sometimes I wonder if we've forgotten what those definitions were ever meant to accomplish in the first place. Instead of helping us find one another, they can slowly become the very walls that keep us apart. And that thought kept pulling me back toward my own journey with witchcraft because there was one relationship in particular that taught me exactly what curiosity can do when it's allowed to replace fear. And that relationship wasn't with another witch. It was with my own mother. When I was in high school, my mom found out that I was interested in witchcraft, and to say she wasn't thrilled would be an understatement. Looking back now, I don't think her reaction came from hatred. I think it came from fear. She had inherited a particular understanding of what the word witch meant. And from her perspective, she was trying to protect her daughter from something she genuinely believed was dangerous. In her mind, witchcraft wasn't simply another spiritual path. It was something dark, deceptive, and spiritually unsafe. She has even told me since that she didn't trust me to be able to handle witchcraft back then. At the time, I experienced that as rejection. But now I can see that it was really the result of two people standing on opposite sides of the same label, each carrying a completely different definition of what that label represented. For a long time, that difference in understanding created distance between us. I felt like there was a part of myself that couldn't fully exist around her because I knew the moment the word witch entered the conversation, everything else about me disappeared behind it. She wasn't seeing the girl who loved nature, who was endlessly curious about spirituality, who felt drawn toward ritual because it made her feel more connected to the world around her. She was seeing the collection of images and warnings that had been handed to her over decades of religious teaching and popular culture. The label had become so large that there was no room left to see the person standing behind it. I don't blame her for that anymore because I think every single one of us has done that exact same thing with one label or another. We rarely realize we're interacting with our own definition instead of another human being. And then something beautiful began to happen over the years. She got curious. It wasn't one dramatic conversation that changed everything overnight. It was dozens of little moments, countless questions, and a willingness to observe my life instead of relying solely on the stories she had inherited about mine. She watched the way I practiced. She saw the values that guided me. She noticed that my spirituality wasn't making me more hateful, more fearful, or more disconnected from the people around me. If anything, she watched it make me more compassionate, more reflective, and more grounded in who I was becoming. And little by little, the label stopped carrying so much weight because she'd finally gotten to know the person behind it. And today, my mom is proud of me and my practice, and that still amazes me when I stop to think about it. She doesn't ask me to hide that part of myself anymore. We can talk openly about spirituality without feeling like we're standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. Hell, she even got into crystals herself, which still makes me smile because if you'd told my teenage self that would one day happen, I never would have believed you. We don't believe all of the same things, and that's okay. What changed wasn't that we suddenly agreed on every theological question. What changed was that curiosity became more important than assumption. She allowed herself to discover that the word witch had never been capable of telling her who I really was. That story has become incredibly important to me because I think it perfectly illustrates what I've been trying to say throughout this episode. The label never changed. I was still a witch. My practice didn't become less authentic just because someone else's understanding evolved. What changed was the relationship. My mom stopped allowing a single word to carry the responsibility of explaining an entire human being. Instead, she allowed experience to become her teacher. She encountered me directly, rather than encountering the stories she'd been told about people like me. That shift didn't just change the way she saw witchcraft, it changed the way we saw each other. I sometimes wonder how different our communities would look if we approached one another with that same kind of openness. Modern witchcraft is full of labels, and many of them serve genuinely useful purposes. They help us find traditions that resonate with us. They help us communicate the broad strokes of our practice without needing to explain every detail each time we meet someone new. There is nothing inherently wrong with calling yourself a green witch, a traditional witch, a Hecatean, a chaos witch, an eclectic practitioner, or any number of other identities that have developed over time. Those words can be incredibly helpful because they act as guideposts. They help us begin a conversation. The problem only begins when we mistake the guidepost for the destination. Take the phrase baby witch as an example. On the surface, it's a simple label intended to communicate that someone is new to the practice. There's nothing particularly offensive about that by itself. Yet I've watched it become something much heavier in online spaces. Some people wear it almost apologetically, feeling like they need permission to speak because they're just a baby witch. Others use it dismissively, intentionally or unintentionally, creating a hierarchy where experience becomes confused with worth. Before long, what started as a simple description quietly becomes an identity that either limits someone's confidence or elevates someone else's ego. The label was originally meant to describe where someone is on their journey, not determine the value of their voice within it. The same thing happens in conversations around black magic and white magic. And I think this is one of the clearest examples of why curiosity matters so much. If someone tells you they practice black magic, what happens inside your mind before you ask a single question? Do you immediately picture someone trying to manipulate other people, cast harmful spells, or intentionally cause suffering? If you do, where did that definition come from? Was it something you studied deeply? Was it something you experienced personally? Or was it something you absorbed from movies, books, social media, or the culture around you? Because the truth is that another practitioner may use those same words to describe work focused on justice, protection, severing abusive energetic ties, or helping survivors reclaim their autonomy after unimaginable harm. The exact same label can hold entirely different meanings depending on the person using it. If we never ask what someone means, we're not actually responding to them. We're responding to our own assumptions. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment because assumptions have a remarkable way of disguising themselves as discernment. We tell ourselves we're simply being cautious, wise, or spiritually aware, when in reality, we've never paused long enough to ask another question. Real discernment is active, it's relational, it listens before it concludes. Assumption, on the other hand, is passive. It reaches for the nearest category, decides the case has already been solved, and quietly moves on. Those two things may feel similar from the inside, but they lead us to very different places. One deepens our understanding of people, while the other slowly narrows the world into categories that become harder and harder to escape. That distinction has become increasingly important in my own practice because the more time I spend with Hecate, the more I realize how impossible she is to reduce to a single sentence. The first time someone hears that Hecate is the goddess of witchcraft, they might think they've learned something significant. And in one sense, they have. It isn't wrong. It's just profoundly incomplete. That single title tells us almost nothing about the complexity of her history, her many epithets, her relationships with the ancient world, or the countless ways people have encountered her across different cultures and centuries. It gives us a place to begin, but it doesn't bring us to the end. And perhaps that is true of every meaningful relationship we will ever have, whether it's with another person, with a deity, or even with ourselves. The longer I've walked this path, the more I've started wondering if we do the exact same thing to ourselves. We spend so much time trying to answer the question, who am I? That we begin collecting labels as though they could somehow contain the fullness of a human life. We say I'm a witch, or I'm a trauma survivor, or I'm anxious, or I'm ADHD. And while each of those statements may contain truth, none of them contains the whole truth. They describe pieces of us, chapters of our story, or experiences that have shaped us, but they can never fully capture the person living beneath them. When we forget that, we slowly begin shrinking ourselves until we fit comfortably inside the words we've chosen to describe us. Instead of using the label as a tool, we start allowing that label to tell us who we're allowed to become. This is why I think language around identity deserves more attention than it often receives, especially for those of us who are healing from trauma. There is a profound difference between saying, I'm an anxious person, and saying, I'm experiencing anxiety. That first sentence quietly suggests permanence. It makes anxiety feel woven into the fabric of who you are, almost as though it is your identity rather than your experience. Yet the second sentence leaves room for movement. It acknowledges that anxiety is a real without allowing it to define the entirety of your existence. The same is true when we say, I'm broken instead of I'm healing, or I'm a survivor instead of remembering that surviving something is only one part of an infinitely more complex life. None of this is about policing language or telling people how they should identify. It's about recognizing that the stories we repeatedly tell ourselves eventually become the lens through which we see the world. I know that firsthand because for years I was carrying around a definition of myself that I believed could never change. Every time I struggled to begin a task, every unfinished project, every forgotten appointment became another piece of evidence supporting the story that I was somehow fundamentally less capable than everyone around me. I wasn't evaluating each moment individually anymore. I was filtering every experience through a label that had become far larger than it was ever intended to be. Looking back now, I realize how much of my energy was spent trying to prove that I wasn't the stereotypes I'd absorbed. I wasn't just fighting executive dysfunction, I was fighting shame. And shame has a remarkable way of convincing us that a description has become a destiny. I think that's one of the greatest dangers of allowing labels to become law. Once a label becomes law, growth begins to feel like betrayal. If I've built my identity around being the anxious one, who am I when I begin to heal? If I've convinced myself that I'm simply lazy because that's what I thought ADHD meant, what happens when I discover that my brain was struggling for reasons I never understood? If I've always introduced myself as one particular kind of witch, am I allowed to change as my practice deepens? Or will other people think I've somehow become less authentic? We don't often talk about it this way, but labels can quietly become prisons when we become more committed to remaining consistent than we are to remaining honest. That's one of the reasons I care so deeply about the idea of sovereignty. I don't mean sovereignty in the sense of doing whatever we want without accountability. I mean sovereignty in the sense of allowing ourselves the freedom to grow, to change our minds, to deepen our understanding, and to discover that who we are today may not be who we are 5 years from now. If our spiritual path is truly alive, shouldn't we expect it to change us? Shouldn't our understanding of ourselves become more nuanced as we gain experience? It wouldn't be strange to It would be strange to expect our relationships with other people to remain exactly the same over decades. So why do we sometimes expect our relationships with ourselves, with the divine, or with our practice to remain frozen in time? Labels can document where we've been, but they should never prevent us from walking farther down the road. The more I reflect on the meditation I had, the more I think it was quietly preparing me for this exact conversation before I even knew what the conversation was going to be. For that brief moment, I experienced something that felt limitless. And the first thing my mind wanted to do afterwards was find words that could contain it. I wanted a sentence that would finally explain it perfectly. I wanted language to succeed where experience had already surpassed it. But maybe it was never possible. Maybe language was never designed to hold reality. Maybe it was only ever designed to point us toward it. The experience itself was always going to be bigger than the words I could choose to describe it. And when I think about it that way, it becomes obvious that people are no different. You can't summarize a human being with a single word any more than you can summarize an ocean with a photograph. The photograph may be beautiful, it may even be accurate, but it can't tell you what the water feels like against your skin, what it sounds like standing on the shore at sunrise, or what it's like to be surrounded by it on every side. The image points towards something real, but it isn't the thing itself. Labels work in much the same way. They can introduce us to someone, they can orient us, they can even help us find one another, but they cannot replace the experience of actually knowing another person. I think the same is true of our relationships with the gods. We can study Hecate's epithets, we can learn her history, we can read ancient texts and modern scholarship. We can spend years exploring how different cultures understood her, and I think all of that matters deeply. But eventually, if our goal is relationship, there comes a point where no amount of information can substitute for encounter. My relationship with Hecate is not built solely on what I've read about her. It's built through ritual, meditation, silence, prayer, mistakes, questions, moments of doubt, and moments of profound connection. None of those things fit neatly into a definition because relationships were never meant to. Just as no one else can fully describe my relationship with my partner or my love for my cats, no label can fully describe what it means to know a deity personally. The label opens the door, but the relationship begins when we choose to walk through it. So I want to leave you with something to reflect on this week. The next time you hear someone describe themselves with a label, whether that's witch, Christian, atheist, ADHD, survivor, pagan, black magician, or anything else, notice what story your mind begins writing before they've finished speaking. Now, don't judge yourself for it because our brains naturally create categories. Simply become aware of it. Then, if you can, ask one more question. Give yourself permission to remain curious just a little longer before deciding you already know who they are. You may discover that the most interesting parts of another human being begin exactly where the label ends. And maybe that's the invitation Hecate was placing in front of me when I opened YouTube. Maybe the lesson was never really about labels at all. Maybe it was about remembering that every person, every deity, every spiritual experience, and even our own identities are always larger than the language we use to describe them. Trauma teaches us to survive through labels. Healing teaches us to look beyond them. I don't think healing asks us to abandon discernment or pretend that patterns don't exist. Instead, I think it asks us to loosen our grip just enough to let curiosity sit beside discernment, allowing relationships to become more important than assumption. Because labels are meant as guides, not as law. They are the beginning of the conversation, never the end of it. And perhaps true sovereignty is found in having the courage to keep discovering ourselves one encounter at a time, rather than believing any single word could ever tell the whole story. Thank you for listening. And remember, honor the truth that keeps you sovereign.